So our next presentation will be on challenges with deleting AWS accounts at scale, and it's sponsored by Sunray. Sunray Security delivers an enterprise identity and data governance platform for AWS, Azure, GCP, and Kubernetes. Their DIG platform is built on a sophisticated graph that identifies and monitors every possible relationship between identities and data that exists inside your cloud. All right, over to Andrew.
Hello, and welcome to my talk on deleting AWS accounts at scale. My name is Andrew Alaniz, and I want to give a shout out to the organizers of Forward Cloud Sec. I know there's been a lot of back and forth with a number of big conferences, whether in person or not this year. These guys have done a great job at organizing and making things smooth. So thank you everyone who's joined us in the audience. It's been an incredible lineup and a lot of great talks this year. We have a few more left, so let's get started. So I'm going to start by kind of setting the stage for where we were, and then I'm going to walk through some of the things that we found as we started deleting a large number of accounts. You'll find that there's some conflicting information within AWS documentation, and there's a number of gotchas to be aware of. So with that, we'll get started. All right, so you have an AWS organization. It could be a handful of accounts, could be tens, hundreds, thousands. It doesn't really matter because the process is the same. But as you scale up, the time factor is going to have an impact there. You have a reason to delete some accounts, and we'll go over some of those a little later, but we'll just assume that for now. And we're going to assume you have a well-architected environment. So I'm not going to go into a lot of recommendations on how things are, but there'll be one or two. And one of those is we're going to assume that we have our root accounts properly protected. And so for every account that we touch, we're going to have to check out the credentials and use MFA to log in. So you're talking 3 to 5 minutes per account. So you can, obviously, as you get to hundreds and thousands, having to do that every time is going to get time costly with time. And then finally, there's no APIs for deleting accounts. So we're talking about clicking buttons in a UI. One of the big challenges that with deleting a lot of accounts. All right, so what's some of the conflicting info? So even as of this presentation, there are at least 3 documents in official AWS documentation on deleting or closing accounts. Now, I will say that this is not a bash AWS session. I've actually been working with AWS and their organizations team and kind of going over some of the challenges we had to try and make it a little more consumable for everyone because each of these has a different perspective on it. And it's not that any of them are necessarily wrong, but there is some missing context depending on which one you find first and what your needs are. So as an example, in this first one, it says terminate all of your resources before closing your account. That seems reasonable, but there's going to be some challenges with that I'll talk about a little later. On the second one, it says make sure you back up any of your data because anything that's going to be stored in the account is lost and cannot be recovered. Also, seems reasonable, but adds a little bit to that first comment and maybe just adds a little ambiguity to the situation. And then third is after the post-closure period, so a little aside, the post-closure period is a 90-day period after you close your account where you still have access to support and billing information. And if worse comes to worst, you can recover services. Let's say you accidentally deleted one that you didn't mean to. You do have the ability to recover those. But it says after the post-closure period, any remaining content in the account is deleted. So you have one article saying delete everything, and then you have another article saying it's going to be deleted for you. So again, just some ambiguity. So I want to walk through kind of, some things to consider before you follow any one of these without the context. So where do you start? So scratch your head and wonder why there's 3 how-tos on how to do this. And don't guess at which one to follow. I'm going to walk you through everything to consider. And there are particular ones that are generally going to be the ones you want to look at. All right, so one assumption we're going to make is that you are using AWS Organizations. Again, like I said, I'm not going to get into why you would or would not be using AWS Organizations, but let's go with the assumption that you are. So don't, and I want to emphasize this, don't remove an account from the organization as part of the deletion process. There are legitimate reasons to need to remove an account from an organization, but as you're going to see, there's a lot of gotchas if you do that. And it's not necessary to delete the account. So this is a perfect example of where there's some ambiguity depending on which of these which of these documents you open up first. So in one of them it says closing a member account. When you close the account that was created in Organizations, it still counts towards your quota during the post-closure period. Now, if you're bumping up against a max, then that could be an issue. There is no published maximum quota in AWS documentation. The only thing that's listed is that there are a quota of 4 by default when you create organizations, but that can be increased. Suffice it to say that you can have thousands of accounts, and unless you do have thousands of accounts, the quota issue is not going to be an issue for you. So here it says, to avoid having the account count against that limit, remove the member accounts from the organization before closing it. Again, don't do that. That's out of context for what we would be doing in a large-scale environment. And then one other piece to consider, if you do remove that account from the organization, is that principal org ID that's in any of your policies, which it should be, is tied to that organization. And once it's removed, principal org ID changes, and it's possible to lock yourself out of those policies. Just like if you misspell something or put the wrong org ID in, it's not anything earth-shattering, but it is something to keep in mind. All right, so what happens if we do remove an account from an organization? And I'll say we happened to find that how-to first, and so that's the way we started. Well, we discovered what happens when you remove an account from an organization and a lot of the things that come with it. So first thing, you lose all your discounts. Enterprise discount program, savings plans, reserved instances, any of those things are gone. So if you still have any compute resources that are running in that account, then you're going to be paying on-demand charges. And so just be prepared for that. Maybe it's not that big of a deal, but it's something to keep in mind. You lose enterprise support. Again, I'm going to repeat that. You lose enterprise support, which is a big deal. Anyone who's managed a large-scale environment knows that enterprise support is essential for a lot of the maintenance type things like billing and organization and things. And so your account team's not going to abandon you in this process, but what this does do is it sends support requests to a different queue. And so there's going to be a little bit more back and forth for your account team to be able to properly support you and get access to the account and things like that. So definitely something to consider there. Before you remove it from the organization, you're required to enter a credit card. Maybe not a huge deal, but could cause some problems with your finance departments, especially if you're on consolidated billing and having to reconcile those credit card charges to cost centers tied to invoices. Also an issue if you've got lots of compute, spending 5 and 6 figures sometimes, depending on the organization, is not unheard of per month that could hit that credit card. Another interesting one that we found was that if you have Shield Advanced running in your organization and you remove that account from the organization, you're not prompted as a reminder. There's no end-user license agreements, but Shield will now be running in that account. Rejoining the organization doesn't seem to solve the problem. And remember that you have a credit card. And so the way Shield works is that if you have it in the organization, it's $3,000 per month, I believe, as of this talk. And that's one time per month for the entire organization. But that's the case also if you have a single account, it's $3,000 per month. And so that's going to be hitting that credit card. Now, one thing that we suspected here, but we're not able to prove, was that once you remove it from the organization, if you immediately close it, or at least close it before the next billing cycle, it seemed to not be an issue to have Shield hitting a credit card. But if that next billing cycle hit, that's when Shield Advanced started hitting the credit card. So again, something interesting to keep in mind if you're removing accounts from an organization. So another one is you're going to lose security services, whether that's Macy, GuardDuty, CloudTrail, Config, anything that's managed at the organization level. those are no longer going to have access to that account. And so you need to be thinking about, does it make sense to be removing this from the organization? And if I do, I'm not going to be blind with a lot of my existing processes. It's probably also a good time to loop in your legal team, because I assume that all of your EDPs and other master service agreements with AWS have gone through legal review. But by having a standalone account, you essentially have a click-through agreement. And I found that a lot of legal teams aren't a huge fan of click-through agreements. So again, just something to think about. All right, while I was putting the talk together, I found this. We weren't using Control Tower, but if you are, this is something you want to look at. So the way Control Tower works is essentially a landing zone within an organization for the creation of accounts. And when those accounts are created, certain guardrails are applied toward the account. Well, in order for you to delete an account that's managed by Control Tower, you have to remove Control Tower. Well, since Control Tower is managing those guardrails, that means you'll now have to have an account in your organization without the guardrails applied that still potentially has user access to it. And so it's just an extra overhead step because you have to remove Control Tower before you can delete the account. So again, just something to think about. Probably something that AWS needs to consider in the removal process there. All right, so you'll notice that in most of those how-tos, they said delete everything in the account before terminating the account. I think there needs to be a clarification here about deleting everything. So it could make sense to delete some things, like compute and storage. But if you delete everything, that's going to include IAM roles, route tables. Maybe you have vulnerability scanners that are scanning the system. If you have roles, cloud security posture management, Macy, guard duty, anything that's using cross-account roles is no longer going to have access to that account. So even if you don't remove the account from the organization, if you delete everything in the account, you're going to lose access to it except for your root account. And so I don't recommend deleting everything, but again, it could make sense to delete a few things. And as we established from the how-tos, once the account's closed, everything will be deleted. So again, not a real good reason to delete everything before you do that. All right, so those were most of the gotchas that we ran into from an AWS standpoint, but I also wanted to cover a few things about doing this right from an enterprise organization, doing this within an existing company. So what I mean by do it right, don't experiment with this one, right? Learn from my mistakes here and do this the right way the first time, because it's going to save you a little bit of pain. So one, most of the actions we discussed, leaving an organization, leaving Control Tower, removing IAM roles, removing logging, anything like that, changing an OU, those should all be security incidents, or at least events that generate security activity, right? And so this is a perfect time for you to ensure that your CloudWatch event rules are running, to ensure that your SIEM is properly alerting on those events, and ensure that your SOC not only sees the events, but understands what they are and how to respond. So great time to practice incident response within AWS. So another piece is consider data retention policies. So one of the things that I've seen is that a lot of policies like this really are thinking or were created with the physical world in mind. Hard drives, data centers, network cables, and didn't fully take into account ephemeral storage, EBS volumes, S3 buckets, etc. And so this is a great time to talk with your app teams and with your lines of business to make sure that they understand this isn't something I can go recover. Once I do this, it's gone. And so do we need to make any backups of this data from a retention standpoint? And then similarly, data destruction policies. And so one, this is probably something you should have talked about before moving data to AWS, but you're not going to get a certificate of destruction through this. So it's a good time to make sure that the way that the data is deleted kind of implicitly is sufficient from legal standpoint within your organization. One of the best ways to ensure that is to use encryption that you can destroy the keys with and make the data unusable. But otherwise, you're relying on AWS saying they deleted the data. All right, so over communicate. This was a big one. and I'll kind of add this one into the next bullet point of tracking changes and dates. But so we obviously followed a change management process, but what we noticed was that this was a little bit bigger. And so we kind of equated this to shutting down a data center. And in doing that, we realized we needed to have more people in the loop on what was happening. And so this is something to consider when you start closing AWS accounts, is ensuring that your communication chain for doing it is broad enough. Obviously, you don't want it so broad that you have to explain to everybody what's happening over and over again, but broad enough so that there's some CYA, right? It's a little bit bigger than a change, and so making sure the right parties are aware is a good deal. So another one with the tracking changes is we had to track some of the changes we were doing separately, because once you delete the accounts, you lose some level of auditing. So obviously, if you have centralized logging within AWS, all those logs are shipped. But if you happen to remove an account from the organization, you're going to need to track that. Additionally, you can log into the accounts once the post-closure period happens. And so there's going to be some discrepancies in your CloudTrail logs, and making sure that just some of your timelines, like if you deleted those roles, you're not getting the CloudTrail data anymore. And so when did you delete the account? When's the post-closure period over? And those kind of things are kind of good to track, because they're not exactly tracked well within AWS. One more piece on this is I would talk with your asset management teams, because you want to understand and make sure they understand how your CMDB is interacting when an API returns nothing. So in this case, if you didn't delete resources before the closure period, they were never actually deleted to a CMDB. They just stopped reporting in. And so does it make them go away? Does it log them as deleted? And you may have to have some manual intervention there and really understand how your CMDB and other asset management tools react to the APIs communicating that way. So lastly, I wanted to talk about some real-world scenarios where this may come into play. So M&A is an obvious one. Whether you're buying or being acquired, there's a good chance that at the very least, you're going to have AWS accounts moving from one organization to another, but often you're going to be deleting accounts. And even if you move from organization A to organization B, a lot of the things that we talked about are going to come into play. And so that's something to think about as you start that process. Next would be legacy architecture migration. So many of you who manage AWS organizations at scale know what I mean. You're going to have technical debt build up in AWS, and as you shut that down, you're probably as often as not going to greenfield that into a new environment, as opposed to kind of assimilate it into the new governance models. And then finally, shutting down a business, whether it's a parent company or a subsidiary, you're gonna come into these issues, and just something to keep in mind. So we talked about a lot of the challenges. So let's talk about how to do it right. And the good news is it's really easy. So we're going to assume that you've already done all the communication and you're ready to delete everything. At that point, log into the account as root. You have to do that. Go to the billing page and you check 4 boxes and click close account, and that's literally all there is to it. You'll have a 90-day waiting period before it's officially closed, but that's it. So pretty easy. This is the link to the most concise information around that, and so I want to make sure that you have that available. Again, thank you for your time today, and I hope that you enjoyed the talk. I'll be around for questions a little later, so hit me up if you can think of anything. Thanks again. Bye.
Thank you, Andrew. We do have a question. So Paul mentions that he always recommends putting the account in a separate OU where everything is denied via SCP. Your thoughts on this?
Totally agree. Not only from a just not to confuse terms, not an AWS organization standpoint, but just organizing the work. That also helped us track when we made changes. Like basically once it was there, those SCPs were applied and we knew that account was done. So that's definitely a good practice.
If there are other questions, if you guys can post them in the Slack channel. One question.
So I had a question about not deleting the resources. We tried doing this before, where we just delete delete the account, and we had issues where teams left resources in the account not knowing that, and it ended up taking out services that unexpectedly. So how do you guys approach that issue, making sure that we don't cause unintended outages?
Yeah, so the first route we went was delete everything, which required some scripting because there's not a delete everything button, and that broke things. And so then second, we went the route of not deleting everything, just shutting down compute and storage resources. And then once it went into the post-closure period, again, that's going to break things because those roles no longer work and nothing can authenticate. So I don't know that there's a way, if you're shutting down accounts, to not break things. I think it's more a matter of tracking the changes and timing with those other teams and systems.
Right, we have another question.
So I wanted to mention to your question about the shutting it. If you do move that account into an OU where the SCP has everything denied, it will still break things, but you can easily move it back out. Whereas, closing an account is going to be a long process of undoing that closure. But if something's going to break, it's going to break quick.
Yeah, and that's a good point. If you want to kind of artificially create a second post-closure period, that would be a good path to go. My recommendation would not be to store them in an OU as like kind of your own post-closure period indefinitely, because at some point you may end up hitting limits in organizations.
Any other questions?
And data retention and data destruction policies.
We have one more.
Thanks for the suggestions on deleting accounts the right way. How many people do you find it kind of takes to process if you have a lot of accounts that need to get closed for whatever reason, like to go through and reset the root credentials and log in and check those boxes? Like, how many people do you have?
Yeah, so there's definitely a risk conversation there because, in my experience, we had, 1 to 3 people that had access to some of those root credentials. And when you take, 1 to 3 people and try to spread that over 300 accounts, 500 accounts, 1,000 accounts, it's going to be a lot slower than doing that if you have more people. And so we essentially kind of made the decision, depending on the scope of the accounts, to add a few more people depending on the team, because you've definitely still got some separation of duties that you've got to consider. And so there's also a lot of noise because, we were alerted to all of the activity, both from the checkout and from the authentication as root. And so there's a lot of noise that it generates. And so, again, that kind of goes to the over-communicate and make sure you've got, the risk conversation, the SOC conversation, make sure they know this is coming. And yeah, so I think there's definitely some challenges. Because there's no APIs, that really kind of artificially exacerbates the issue. If AWS were to release some APIs for this, it would make it a lot easier.
Definitely agreed on that last one. Thank you.
Other questions? I do have one last question for you in regards to compliance. Did you run into any hurdles with your compliance team?
Well, I don't know that I could go into that specifically, but I will say that I would spend some time ahead of time on data destruction and data retention to make sure that you have the right people involved and the right risks understood by the right teams before you start deleting AWS accounts.
Any final questions? All right, well, thank you, Andrew. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Actually, we did have one last question come in, if you have time. For log retention, did you do anything to segment or label logs from accounts that have been suspended? Or do they live with the rest of the logs?
Yeah, so in our case, once they're suspended, that's kind of when it shuts off. So before that, they were still active accounts. So we didn't treat them any differently than other logs. It was all part of our centralized logging architecture. So, all of the CloudTrail logs were centralized together.
Right. Well, thank you again, Andrew.